Let's be honest, the work ethic these days is dead and buried. We are squarely living in a generation defined by entitlement and handouts. It comes down to improper training and the wrong mindset. Well, if there is one thing Gene Simmons never mastered, it is the ability to keep his mouth shut. At the age of 68, the legendary Kiss frontman looks back on the history of rock and roll with absolutely zero filters, zero apologies, and zero tolerance for bass players who refuse to follow his playbook. In Gene's world, the bass guitar represents raw power, strict discipline in control. It is definitely not about showing off or stroking your own ego. Over the decades, 7 specific bassists crossed that line, and they did it in very distinct ways. One of them turned the instrument into a spectacle you couldn't look away from. Another looked like he barely wanted to be in the building. A third musician challenged every single thing Gene thought rock music stood for. And there is one name on this list that will catch you completely off guard. This is not a nostalgia trip. This is a brutal critique coming straight from the demon himself. Coming in at number 7, we have Flea. Whenever Gene Simmons opens up about the art of bass playing, he always circles back to one golden rule: function must come before flash. In his eyes, the bass is not there to fight for the spotlight. Its sole purpose is to anchor the track lock in perfectly with the drums and quietly steer the band's energy from the shadows. That specific philosophy explains exactly why Flea, the hyperactive bassist for the Red Hot Chili Peppers, embodies everything Gene Simmons has openly criticised about the modern state of the instrument. You simply cannot ignore Flea's style. It demands your attention. We're talking about aggressive slap bass, machine gun runs, constant motion, performing half naked and launching himself across the stage like a maniac. His approach often sounds more like a lead instrument taking a solo than a rhythmic foundation holding it down. But for millions of die-hard fans, that chaotic intensity is the secret sauce that makes the Red Hot Chili Peppers legendary. Flea doesn't just play the notes, he puts on a full-blown theatrical production. However, from where Gene Simmons is standing, that level of energy is a violation. It is the moment where a bassist stops working for the song and starts working for their own vanity. Gene has repeatedly voiced his disgust for what he calls musical showboating, particularly when that behaviour comes from the rhythm section. In his opinion, the low end is something you should feel in your chest rather than analyse with your ears. It is supposed to drive the music forward without begging for a standing ovation. Flea conversely wants you to hear every single note and watch every acrobatic move while he executes it. To Gene, that isn't rebellion or cutting-edge innovation, it is just massive ego masquerading as artistic expression. The thing that truly separates these two icons isn't raw talent. Simmons has never seriously claimed that Flea lacks technical ability. Even his biggest haters have to admit that Flea has speed, skill and creativity for days. The real war here is philosophical. Gene operates on the belief that rock music is at its peak when it is simple, sexual and straight to the point. Flea's complex cocktail of funk, punk and jazz fusion comes off as unnecessary clutter to a purist like Gene. While Simmons views restraint and discipline as the ultimate strength, Flea throws a party for chaos. Where Gene values a steady machine, Flea thrives on being totally unpredictable. And of course, we cannot ignore the massive generational tension at play here. Simmons cut his teeth in an era where bass players knew their place, staying in their lane. The role was supportive, rock-steady, and largely invisible to the audience. Flea burst onto the scene during a time when the rulebook was being tossed into the fire. It was an era where punk attitude smashed into funk virtuosity, and your stage presence mattered just as much as your sound. For Gene, that collision didn't elevate a rock and roll, it watered it down. He has frequently hinted that slap bass in particular turns a song into a math problem rather than an emotional experience. Then there is the issue of visual presentation. Gene Simmons' Kiss was a massive visual spectacle. But even with the makeup and pyrotechnics, everything was calculated and every costume told a specific story. Every member of the band had a distinct role to execute. By contrast, Flea's stage persona feels like a riot waiting to happen. It is gritty, spontaneous and completely erratic. A control freak like Gene has never been comfortable with that level of anarchy. This is especially true when that chaos is coming from the guy who is supposed to be the band's anchor. In Gene's world, the bassist is the foundation. In Flea's world, the bassist is a co-star fighting for the front page. That fundamental difference creates serious friction. When the rhythm section tries to become the visual centre, Gene feels the band's entire equilibrium gets thrown out of whack. It isn't that Flea is bad at his job. It is simply that he shatters every unwritten law Gene lives by. Ironically, these two men have way more in common than Gene would probably like to admit. Both of them are absolute forces of nature. They both command the room instantly, and they both played a massive part in shaping their band's iconic sounds and images. But while Gene Simmons views authority and strict restraint as the keys to a band's survival, Flea is the poster child for freedom and excess. So when Gene looks at Flea, he doesn't see a bass god. He sees a cautionary tale. He sees a guy who loudly refuses to stay in the background, who purposefully dismantles proper technique, and who offers all the energy with none of the structure. To the crowd, he is a pioneer. To Gene Simmons, he is just too much. And if you thought that take was spicy, wait until you hear about the next guy who pushes Gene's patience even further. Coming in at number 6, we have Chris Novoselic. Gene Simmons has always believed that if you are a rock musician, you should be desperate for it. You should crave the fame, the money, the dominance, and the cultural influence. He never tried to hide his ambition, and he certainly never apologised for it. In Gene's universe, hunger isn't just an option. It is the absolute engine that powers true greatness. When the grunge revolution exploded in the early 1990s, Nirvana sat on the throne of the world while actively hating the crown. But Gene didn't see that as artistic integrity. He looked at them and saw pure ingratitude. Take Chris Novoselic's bass lines, which were stripped back and simple on purpose. We are talking about basic root notes, steady rhythms, and zero flashiness or ego. Sure, it was the perfect glue for that raw, dirty distortion. Nirvana was famous for giving Kurt Cobain's lyrics the room to scream. But to a technician like Gene Simmons, that minimalism looked like a tragedy evidence that musical standards were crashing down. Gene has spent decades slamming the musicianship of the grunge era, arguing that you should earn fame through mastery and command, not just by having a bad attitude and lucky timing. In Gene's eyes, Chris playing was the mascot for a movement that celebrated apathy instead of chasing perfection. However, what really drove Gene up the wall wasn't just the notes, it was Chris's entire vibe. Most rock bassists are peacocks desperate for attention, but Chris looked like he wanted to crawl out of his skin. He didn't own the stage or push himself into the spotlight. There was no projection of power. He refused to dominate the room. Gene didn't call that being humble. He called it a distinct lack of ambition and hunger. In the Simmons playbook, rock music is about assertion and aggression. You need to have presence. You need to be in control. If you look like you don't want the crown, Gene believes you have no business wearing it, and this cultural clash went way deeper than just 4 strings. Gene Simmons built an empire on the philosophy that rock and roll should be loud, over the top, sexual, and shamelessly commercial. To him, success is something you grab with both hands and celebrate, not something you apologise for. Nirvana, on the other hand, acted like being the biggest band on earth was a curse. Chris was vocal about hating fame, capitalism, and the industry machine. These are topics Gene has mocked relentlessly. To him, biting the hand that feeds you isn't rebellious, it is just massive hypocrisy. From where Gene was sitting, Chris Novoselic wasn't just a bassist in a band that rejected traditional rock values. He was actively spitting on the history of the genre. Gene's perspective was that Christ represented the absolute antithesis of what a rock star should be. He refused to make it a spectacle. He didn't show off, he didn't sell the fantasy to the fans, and he didn't indulge in the wild excesses that keep the myth alive. For Gene Simmons, who treats rock as both high art and cutthroat business, that casual mentality felt personally disrespectful. If rock and roll is a war for the audience's soul, Christ wasn't behaving like a warrior. Gene has frequently claimed that Nirvana's breakthrough lowered the bar for everyone, allowing raw emotion to completely replace technical skill. Because of his subdued style, Chris became the easy target for this theory. It wasn't that he played the wrong notes, but that he refused to play more than the bare minimum. In Gene's universe, doing just enough doesn't get you a gold star. It is a sign that you are lazy. It signals that you are content with mediocrity instead of striving to be a conqueror of the world. The rift only widened after Nirvana dissolved. Chris didn't chase the limelight. He basically vanished from the mainstream pop culture radar. He pivoted to political activism and cut the celebrity circus almost entirely out of his life. He didn't launch a desperate solo career or hang out with other rock gods, which is exactly what Gene would have done. To Simmons, walking away was just the final confirmation of his doubts. Anyone who's handed the keys to the kingdom and throws them away clearly never cared enough to begin with. Gene's issue with Chris was never about them as people. The animosity was purely a war of ideologies. Chris embodied a style where humility beat pride, simplicity beat flash, and hiding in the back was better than ruling the front, everything Gene opposes. For the fans, the image of Chris Novoselic as the bassist for Nirvana remains solid, honest, and refreshingly unpretentious. Gene Simmons, however, sees a wasted roster spot and a lack of commitment, which might just be the ultimate sin in rock and roll history. Number 5, Nikki Sixx. On paper, Gene Simmons and Nikki Sixx should be best friends. They are both bass players. They are both shameless self-promoters who turned their bands into massive global brands as much as musical acts. But that mirror image is exactly why they butt heads and why Gene often uses Nikki as a warning sign of what happens when image eats substance for breakfast. Gene Simmons has never kept it a secret that he believes musical chops still matter, even in the most theatrical sides of the business. While he loves the spectacle, the makeup and the controversy, he insists that the foundation has to be discipline and competence. To Gene's shock, value without structure is empty. He feels Mötley Crüe often leaned way too hard on the chaos and the scandals without earning it with their instruments. Let's be honest, Nikki Sixx's bass playing was never the driving force of the Mötley Crüe sound. His lines are functional and repetitive, designed to keep the beat rather than impress anyone. The music was crafted specifically to prop up the visual spectacle rather than to highlight any virtuoso fingerwork. For the die-hard enthusiast, that raw simplicity hits the spot because Mötley Crüe never claimed to be about intricate compositions or complex arrangements. It was strictly about swagger and rebellion. However, for a titan like Gene Simmons, that stripped-back approach just added fuel to a fire he had been stoking for years, the idea that certain bass players lean on logos, tall tales and stage characters to cover up their lackluster playing abilities. In his view, the theatrics become a convenient mask to hide a limited musical range. Simmons has never bitten his tongue regarding what he views as a fashion-first rock scene where being infamous matters more than actually mastering your instrument. Within that framework, Nikki Sixx emerged as the ultimate poster child for a specific era, a time when smashing hotel rooms, living in excess and general dysfunction often took centre stage over the actual notes being played. In Simmons' eyes, the distinction between Kiss and Mötley Crüe boiled down to one crucial thing: intent. Kiss manufactured their madness with corporate precision and safety rails, whereas the Crüe actually inhabited the mayhem and allowed it to swallow them whole. Bubbling underneath all that is a quiet, simmering rivalry. It is no secret that a young Sixx looked up to the Demon early on, openly citing Kiss as a massive inspiration for his own path. But as is often the case in show business, hero worship can curdle into bitter competition very quickly. Simmons, who considers himself the architect of the shock rock blueprint, has zero tolerance for acts he feels simply Xeroxed his plan without adding any value. In his book, mimicking the greats without evolving the sound is just pure laziness. He has also thrown plenty of shade at the glam metal scene for obsessing over hairspray and spandex rather than staying power. For Gene, you earn your stripes through longevity. Sticking around for decades is the only real evidence of discipline and worth. He is convinced Kiss lasted this long because of strategy holding back and an iron grip on the business side of things. Sixx's highly publicised battles with substance abuse only validated Gene's theory that unbridled chaos is a self-eating snake. The way Simmons sees it, rock stars who let go of the steering wheel are voluntarily giving up their power. The real wedge driving these two apart is the concept of accountability. Simmons operates on the belief that being a frontman means shouldering the load for the brand, the crew, and the entire machine behind the music. Conversely, Six wrapped his arms around self-destruction, turning his personal spiral into folklore that became inseparable from the band's identity. To Gene, that was not bravery, it was just recklessness masquerading as being real and authentic. That said, the Kiss icon hasn't entirely written off Nicky's legacy. He admits that Motley Crue left a crater in the hard rock landscape and shaped the culture significantly. However, in Gene's world, recognising someone's fame is not the same as respecting their craft. Big influence doesn't justify taking the easy road. Stardom without a solid base is fleeting, Simmons argues, even if it feels permanent while the cameras are flashing. Ultimately, Simmons views Six as a bassist who was far better at selling a logo than holding down a rhythm section. He sees a performer who chose the image over skill development, preferred anarchy to order, and chased the legend rather than a long career. It is the story of a man who built a kingdom on attitude instead of command. While the fan base worships Nicky as a warrior who transmuted his pain into art and survived to tell the tale. Simmons sees him as a cautionary reminder. It is proof that a show with no underlying substance eventually runs out of gas. Moving on to number 4, we have Geddy Lee. Out of everyone Simmons has ever critiqued, the Rush frontman stands out as the most confusing contradiction. Unlike the others on this hit list, Geddy's problem wasn't a lack of chops, drive, or dedication. Quite the reverse, Simmons felt Lee was almost too talented, too precise and too brainy for what rock and roll is fundamentally supposed to be at its core. The Demon has spent years arguing that rock music hits hardest when it remains primal, simple and easy to digest. In his playbook, getting complicated is the fastest way to lose the crowd and kill the vibe. Give him 3 chords, a catchy chorus and a punchy message that is the trusted recipe he used to build a global empire. But Rush with Geddy at the musical helm took a sledgehammer to that rulebook at every opportunity. They swapped simplicity for surgical precision. Instead of relying on gut instinct, they leaned heavily into high-level intellect. Lee's bass lines are legendary for their sheer complexity. Strange time signatures, lightning-fast fretwork and melodies that dance around the percussion defined their sound, utilising an almost scientific level of accuracy. Among fellow players, Geddy is rightly hailed as a virtuoso, someone who completely redefined what a bass guitar could do in a rock band. However, for someone like Simmons, that level of skill crosses the line into self-indulgence. He has poked fun at progressive rock for being musicians' music stuff that dazzles other players but bores the average listener to tears. From where he stands, Rush was putting brain power ahead of raw feeling. Their songs dove deep into philosophy, sci-fi, epics and abstract thought, completely skipping the usual rock tropes of romance, rebellion and partying. Gene dismisses this as overthinking it, maintaining that rock should be a punch to the gut, not a homework assignment for your brain. To him, you shouldn't study the music, you should just experience it viscerally. The divide was only deepened by their clashing personalities. Geddy has always been the quiet, thoughtful, introverted type, the total inverse of Simmons's loud in-your-face theatrics. Gene feeds on drama, provokes the media, and thrives on stirring the pot. He dominates every interview and stage he steps on. Meanwhile, Geddy stays away from the noise, preferring to let the music do all the talking. That stark difference made Rush seem like aliens in the world of rock stardom as defined by Gene Simmons, even if he has always tipped his hat to their massive success. Despite all the chaos surrounding them, the band wasn't just surviving, they were evolving into something massive. We are talking about moving millions of albums, staying on the road for what felt like an eternity, and building one of the most hardcore fan bases in music history. And the wildest part, they did almost all of this without a hit radio single or the mainstream media machine pushing them. These fans weren't just listeners, they were disciples committed for a lifetime. But you know how Gene Simmons is? Even a resume that impressive wasn't enough to completely win him over. He respected the hustle the success earned through the grind of traditional touring, but he didn't view it as the gold standard of rock stardom. Simmons has gone on record plenty of times painting progressive rock as safe. In his eyes, it is music completely stripped of danger. It is defined by surgical precision, absolute control, and almost a scholarly vibe. A Rush concert was a structured, highly professional event executed with meticulous care. Every single note had a purpose. Every night the performance was identical to the one before it. For a guy like Gene, that kills the vibe. It removes the thrill of risk that defines rock and roll. Geddy Lee might be a genius, but he wasn't threatening. Instead, he was just impressive. And in the book of Gene, being impressive and being a rock star are two totally different things. What really gets under Gene's skin is that history proved this squeaky clean approach actually works. They proved that you could marry high-level creativity with stability and still conquer the world. They built a massive empire without a single drug scandal, without the shock value, and without the excess. They didn't have to weather the storm, they just ignored it. They didn't have to manufacture controversy just to stay relevant in the headlines. That reality quietly shakes the pillars of everything Gene believes rock is built on. Yet even today, he struggles to give them full credit. Why? Because accepting the Rush method means admitting you don't have to dumb down the music to fill stadiums. It proves music can be intelligent, complex, and emotionally deep while still packing a serious punch. That restraint doesn't kill the energy, it just changes the flavour. Ask any fan and they will tell you Geddy Lee is the greatest bassist to ever walk the earth. He is a musician who literally expanded the vocabulary of the instrument, but to Simmons, he represents the moment rock lost its teeth and forgot its primal roots. It isn't necessarily bad, it is just too brainy for Gene's specific brand of fire-breathing rock and roll. That feud was about intellect versus instinct, but this next one, this strikes a much more personal nerve for the demon. Do not blink. Coming in at number 3 is Sting versus Gene Simmons. Nothing annoys him more than a rocker who acts like he is embarrassed to be a rocker. Sting has always embodied a specific archetype of artist that Gene instinctively does not trust. We are talking about the bassist who didn't just want fame, he wanted spiritual transcendence. He was a guy who seemed desperate to elevate himself above the genre rather than get down in the mud with it. Although you cannot deny the rise of the Police. That band mashed up punk urgency with chill reggae rhythms and sharp pop hooks to create a sound that absolutely ruled the late 1970s and early 1980s. As a player, Sting wasn't trying to tear the strings off. He was melodic, incredibly controlled and influential in a subtle way. His bass lines anchored the songs, driving the melody while locking down the groove. On paper, there was a lot there for Gene to respect. But in Gene's world, respect isn't awarded for chart numbers alone. It comes down to attitude. And Sting's attitude always felt a million miles away from the visceral core of rock music. Simmons has spent years bashing what he calls the art school intellectuals musicians who treat rock like a phase they need to graduate from. Sting, with his jazz fusion, literary lyrics, classical training and eventual shift to loop music, fit that profile to a T. To Gene, it looked like Sting viewed rock and roll as a mere stepping stone, not the final destination. It wasn't a marriage, it was a fling. And the fact that Sting was handling both duties while fronting the band only made the annoyance worse. In the Simmons philosophy, the bass player is there to hold the roof up, not to give the audience a lecture. You are the foundation, not the professor at the podium. Sting flipped that script. He was writing deep, introspective poetry about complex themes and delivering them with a cool, calm demeanour. His controlled stage presence was the polar opposite of Gene's doctrine, which states rock must be loud, reckless, indulgent and screaming with danger. Then you have the personality clash. Gene Simmons lives for the spectacle, the provocation, the sex, the controversy and the sheer excess. He believes rock should shock first and explain later. Sting, on the other hand, curated an air of intense seriousness. His songs tackled heavy stuff like politics, religion, isolation and global morality. To Gene, that seriousness sucked the life out of the genre. Rock isn't supposed to teach you a lesson. It is supposed to seduce, intimidate and dominate you. So naturally, Sting could not escape the gaze of Gene's scepticism. Even after the Police took over the world selling millions and touring globally like Rush did without radio help, they did it without the circus. No shocking antics, no fake feuds. They just dressed in normal clothes, plugged in and played, exactly because he prioritised technical musicianship above everything else. Gene couldn't deny the sales figures, but he absolutely refused to buy into the method. For the demon winning without the glitz, glamour and fireworks was basically worthless. And when the police decided to call it quits, that just deepened Gene's suspicions. Instead of embracing the wild hotel trashing rock star lifestyle, Sting decided to bore everyone with jazz flutes, orchestration and a whole lot of patience. His solo career shifted from that raw, unrefined punk anger into something wine-sippingly sophisticated. To Gene, this entire pivot wasn't just a style change, it was a rejection. It was clear evidence that Sting never truly respected rock and roll as the final destination. It was the ultimate proof that for Sting, rock was just a stepping stone, something to use, and then look down upon rather than commit to for life. Now, Gene loves to frame his criticisms of Sting carefully acting like they aren't personal attacks, but rather high-minded philosophical debates about the soul of music. But in that narrative, Sting is painted as the traitor, the bassist who turned his back on the primal instincts of rock to chase the snooty elegance of the jazz world. He's the guy who chose control over chaos, who took the safe scenic route instead of flirting with danger, and who preferred overthinking to pure impulse. But let's be real, what truly grinds Gene's gears is the undeniable proof found in Sting's successful career path. It drives him crazy to see that it is actually possible to achieve massive success without indulging in all the wild excesses. It proves that influence can come from restraint and that rock doesn't always have to be a screaming match to be heard. These uncomfortable truths slowly chip away at Gene's core belief that shock value and spectacle are the absolute requirements for rock music survival. To the fans, Sting is a limitless genius who evolved into a world-class icon. But to Gene, he's a guy who climbed the rock mountain just to stand at the top and look down on everyone else. And honestly, for Gene, nothing is more disgusting than a poser, someone pretending to be rock and roll while secretly judging the whole scene. Next up on the hit list is number 2, the legendary Paul McCartney. Paul might be worshipped as one of the most respected bassists in history, but in Gene Simmons' universe, respect definitely does not mean they are on the same page. When it comes to the Beatle-Gene's beef was never about talent. He knows the guy can play. The problem was always the philosophy. We are talking about two radically different universes regarding what rock music is supposed to look like, represent, and ultimately achieve. Gene Simmons has been throwing shade at the Beatles' legacy for years, frequently claiming that Elvis Presley belongs on the throne above them in the rock hierarchy. That hot take alone puts him in the ring with Paul McCartney, whose melodic bass playing didn't just support the tracks, it literally redefined the instrument's role in pop culture. Paul treated the bass like a lead voice singing through the strings, but to a powerhouse like Gene, that approach just felt weak and lacking in brute force. In his mind, melody wasn't supposed to be the boss. Dominance was, and dominance is exactly what rock was invented to project. McCartney's bass lines were always so thoughtful, emotional, and often frustratingly understated. They flowed like water with the song instead of crushing it, filling the gaps with warmth. Gene's style. It was the total opposite, blunt, aggressive, and hitting like a hammer. He wielded his bass like a literal weapon of war, simple, heavy, and demanding total submission. While Paul approached music as high art and expression, Gene looked at it as a game of conquest and corporate control. That clash went way deeper than just finger placement. It shaped exactly how both of these titans viewed the concept of success. Paul saw music as a creative journey, following the muse, even if it meant stepping out of the spotlight. Gene saw it as a scalable empire to be built brick by gold brick. Touring, selling merch, branding, and licensing deals weren't just side hustles. They were the scoreboards of victory. For Gene's success wasn't just about having influence. It was about massive expansion. The idea of leaving a single penny on the table is practically a sin in the church of Gene Simmons. Paul's willingness to stop touring, skip the aggressive merch sales, or choose personal fulfillment over constant growth challenged Gene's entire definition of winning. In Gene's world, success has to be maximised, tracked and monetised. Anything less than that feels like a complete failure. Gene has also famously criticised the Beatles' mythology, that romantic belief that artistic purity is somehow more important than commercial domination. Paul McCartney became the poster boy for that idea of bassist, who valued pretty emotions over aggression, beauty over shock, and restraint over excess. To a hardliner like Gene, that kind of philosophy just softened the razor-sharp edge of rock and roll. In his head, rock is supposed to be dangerous, provocative, and constantly in your face. Even Paul's avoidance of shock and controversy became a friction point. Gene believes rock needs to offend people, smash boundaries, and scream for attention. Paul did the opposite. He soothed. His music invited you in for tea rather than kicking down your front door. While Gene was busy embracing every excess, Paul trusted in pure songwriting and connection. And the thing that unsettled Gene the most was what Paul actually proved. He demonstrated that winning the cultural war doesn't require you to be a tyrant, constantly dominating the news cycle. He showed that longevity doesn't need endless drama, and that bass playing doesn't have to be aggressive to be incredibly powerful. Paul's influence has lasted decades, not because he was the loudest in the room, but because his music touched people's souls. For Gene Simmons, that reality quietly destroys everything he preaches about the music industry. Because if Paul's nice guy approach worked, and history says it absolutely did, then rock doesn't have to be loud, sexual and confrontational to survive. To the fans, Paul remains one of the greatest to ever touch a bass. For a perfectionist like Gene Simmons, this guy is basically the living embodiment of every bad decision you could possibly make, a path he would never walk down, even if it ended in legendary status. You might roll your eyes at his opinion on the last guy, but when it comes to the top spot on his hate list, there is absolutely zero wiggle room here. Taking the number one slot is none other than Sid Vicious. But here is the tea in Simmons' world. Calling Sid a lousy bass player is actually being too kind. To him, Vicious was not just untalented, he was a walking natural disaster that levelled the entire foundation of what rock and roll was meant to be. Sure, the punk scene worshipped Sid as this gritty icon of pure rage and anti-system glory. But Gene, he did not put on those rose-coloured glasses. All he saw was a messy train wreck, total chaos with zero skill, loud noise with no point and destruction, just for the hell of it. The Kiss frontman has stuck to one golden rule his entire career. If you are going to rebel, you better actually know how to play your instrument first. In his playbook, shock value is not random. It is a calculated business move. You do not just get to provoke people. You have to earn the right to freak them out. Any scandal you create needs to be backed up by serious musical chops. Rock is not some happy accident. It is a carefully engineered machine, and you are the mechanic. And this is where the Sex Pistols star failed miserably on every single level. It is no secret that his skills on the four-string were laughable. Honestly, half the time they were practically non-existent. The industry is flooded with wild tales about sound engineers unplugging his amp during live shows, burying his track in the mix, or just hiring a ghost player for studio sessions. It is legendary stuff, but not in a good way. For a control freak like Simmons, that is not some cool punk authenticity. That is straight up fraud masquerading as being real. But the thing that really drove Gene up the wall was not just the lack of talent, it was the total lack of effort. Sid did not just suck, he did not give a damn that he sucked. Simmons has spent decades roasting the concept that vibes and attitude are enough to make you a star. In his universe, you need to bleed for it. Sweat discipline and mastering your craft are non-negotiable. So naturally, Vicious became the poster child for literally everything the Kiss bassist hates about the music industry. He was the face of a movement that valued smashing things over practicing scales and looking cool over actually being good. To Gene, punk rock did not just lower the bar for entry. Sid took that bar, snapped it in half and buried it 6 feet under the floorboards. Gene treats rock like an empire, something to dominate culture, steer the narrative and build a legacy that lasts forever. Sid, he was just an arsonist trying to burn the whole kingdom down with no plan to rebuild. There was zero strategy, no desire to get better and absolutely no thought for the future. It was all about the now impulsive, self-destructive and ultimately fatal. In Simmons' eyes, acting like that is not true rebellion. It is just giving up and calling it a revolution. Beyond the music, the philosophical gap between these two icons is wider than the Grand Canyon. Gene sees rock stars as generals, powerful, confident leaders who control the room and have massive ambition. Sid, on the other hand, was a beacon of pure nihilism. He spat in the face of responsibility, hated authority, and clearly did not care about staying alive. He was not chasing a 50-year career. He was not chasing greatness. For a business mogul like Gene, that attitude immediately disqualified Sid from the conversation. You cannot be a serious musician or an icon if you do not respect the game. Watching the Sex Pistols blow up so fast just made Gene bitter. To him, their success proved a dangerous theory that if you create enough drama, you do not actually need talent, and that messiness sells better than mastery. Vicious did not get famous for a killer bass line or a hit song. He got famous for the things he broke. He trashed his public image, ruined his relationships, wrecked his health, and in the end destroyed his own life. You will often hear Simmons preaching about duty, not just owing a good show to the fans who pay, but respecting the art of music itself. In that light, Sid was the anti-Simmons. While Gene was busy building the Kiss empire with calculated theatrical shock, Sid was just letting the chaos run wild, with absolutely no breaks. One man played the long game to become a legend. The other sprinted toward his own destruction. Now, to the die-hard punk fans, Sid is still a god, a frozen moment of raw, beautiful chaos that defines an era. But ask Gene and he will tell you straight rebellion without the skills to back it up is not freedom. It is a dead-end road that leads absolutely nowhere. The Kiss icon has never faked being nice, and getting older has not made him any softer. For him, the bass is not a prop to make you look cool. It is the glue that holds the entire band together. These 7 bassists managed to cross lines that Gene thinks are sacred. Whether you think he is a genius or a grumpy old rock star, one thing is undeniable. The demon has always played the game by his own rulebook. But now I want to hear from you. Is he right, or is he totally out of touch? Sound off in the comments below, smash that like button and make sure you are subscribed for more wild rock and roll deep dives. Catch you in the next video.